The air above London was thick with smoke that August morning of 1305, the kind that smelled of sweat, iron, and fear. From the crowded streets near Smithfield, voices rose like the hum of a restless hive. People were gathering, drawn by a rumor that had spread like wildfire across the city: the execution of the most hated man in England, William Wallace, the Scottish rebel who had defied a king. For months, his name had been whispered in taverns and courtrooms alike, carrying both terror and reverence. Some called him a traitor, others in secret called him a hero. But to the English crown, he was something far worse, a reminder that the will of a single man could wound an empire. Before the crowd ever saw his face, they heard the iron creak of the cart's wheels. Shackled in chains, his body bruised, his face marked by exhaustion but not defeat, Wallace stood tall even as soldiers jeered. He was thinner than legend, his hair matted with grime, his back straight despite the weight of iron pulling at his wrists. The people spat and threw mud, shouting words like murderer and traitor. Yet others, quieter, hidden among them, could not look away. They had heard of Stirling Bridge. They had heard of Falkirk. They had heard of a man who had stood against impossible odds and, for a moment, made Scotland free. But to understand why this man's death would become legend, one had to return to where it all began, not in the courts of kings, but in the wild, untamed heart of Scotland. He was born around 1270, near Elderslie, to a minor noble family. The world he entered was one of turmoil. Scotland was a land divided, not by language or faith, but by ambition. Kings died without heirs, nobles fought for thrones, and the shadow of England loomed over the northern hills like a storm that would never end. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, saw Scotland not as a nation, but as a prize. His armies marched north, claiming to bring order, but what they brought was fire. Castles were seized, villages burned, and men were forced to kneel. And somewhere among the ashes, a boy named William Wallace decided he would never kneel to another man. In those early years, little is certain. Some say he studied under monks, learning Latin and swordplay in equal measure. Others say he grew up in the forests, becoming a ghost among the trees. What's certain is that when England's iron hand tightened around Scotland's throat, Wallace struck back, not as a soldier of any army, but as a man who could no longer bear the taste of submission. His rebellion began not with an army, but with a single act of defiance. In the town of Lanark, an English sheriff named William de Heselrigge ruled with cruelty. One day, according to legend, Heselrigge ordered the death of a woman. Some say she was Wallace's wife. Others say she was merely someone he loved. Her killing was meant as a warning to the Scots. Instead, it became the spark that lit a war. Wallace stormed into Lanark with a handful of men and killed Heselrigge himself. The act was brutal, deliberate, and it echoed across the land. For the first time, the English occupiers realized that the Scots were no longer afraid. The rebellion had found its voice. From there, Wallace vanished into the woods, gathering outlaws, farmers, and fugitives. They were untrained, underarmed, and hopelessly outnumbered. Yet they followed him with a kind of loyalty that can only be born of desperation. "You can take our lives," he would later say, "but you will never take our freedom." Those words, whether real or legend, captured the fire that burned within him. He was not fighting for land or titles. He was fighting for the idea that no man, no matter how small his birth, should live as a slave under another's flag. The English saw him as a bandit. But in the summer of 1297, that bandit did the impossible. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace and his co-commander Andrew de Moray faced an English army nearly 3 times their size. The English, confident in their power, laughed as they advanced, knights gleaming in the sun, banners fluttering proudly. But Wallace had studied their arrogance. The narrow wooden bridge that crossed the River Forth became his weapon. As the English troops began to cross, Wallace waited until half their army was trapped midstream. Then, with a single command, his men surged forward. Arrows flew, axes struck, and chaos erupted. The bridge collapsed under the weight of men and horses. The river turned red with blood. When it was over, thousands of English soldiers lay dead or drowned. Scotland had won, not through strength, but through cunning. For the first time, Edward's armies had been humiliated, and Wallace the outlaw became something greater, the guardian of Scotland. For a brief, shining moment, Scotland stood free. Wallace ruled not as a king, but as a protector, enforcing justice where others sought vengeance. Yet his rise made him a marked man. The nobles, jealous of his fame, began to whisper, and Edward, burning with fury, prepared for revenge. In 1298, the English king personally led his army north, determined to crush the rebellion once and for all. What followed was the Battle of Falkirk, a day that would test the limits of Wallace's courage. The Scots fought bravely, their spearmen forming tight circles known as schiltrons, walls of pikes meant to hold back charging cavalry. For hours, they held the line, even as English arrows rained down like iron hail. But the tide turned when Scottish nobles betrayed their cause, withdrawing their cavalry and leaving Wallace exposed. The English seized the moment. Their horsemen broke through, cutting down men by the hundreds. The ground was slick with blood and mud. Wallace fought until the very end, his sword flashing like lightning amid the smoke. But even he could not fight the weight of betrayal. When the battle was lost, he vanished once more, not defeated, but haunted. For years, he moved like a shadow through the Highlands. The English called him a ghost. The Scots called him a legend. But legends cannot hide forever. Betrayal, it seemed, would follow him to the grave. In 1305, near Glasgow, Wallace was captured by a Scottish knight named John de Menteith, a man who had once called him friend. Whether for gold, favor, or fear, Menteith handed him over to the English. Bound in chains, Wallace was dragged south toward London. The journey took weeks, and at every village crowds gathered to see the rebel who had defied a king. Some cursed him, some cheered, but Wallace said little. His silence was his final act of rebellion. By the time he reached the Tower of London, the city buzzed with anticipation. The English crown had not simply captured a man, it had captured a symbol. Edward I intended to make an example of him, to remind all of Britain what happened to those who challenged his authority. The sentence was not death alone. It was degradation, humiliation, destruction of body and soul. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was brought from the Tower to Westminster Hall to stand trial for treason. The hall was filled with nobles, soldiers, and clerics. His chains clinked against the stone floor as he was led before the justices. The charge was read aloud: treason against the English crown. But when asked for his plea, Wallace's voice cut through the murmurs, calm, clear, and unbroken. "I could not be a traitor," he said, for I owe no allegiance to Edward of England." The words struck like thunder. Gasps filled the hall. Even in defeat, Wallace refused to bow. The verdict, of course, was predetermined. He was found guilty. The punishment: he was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal sentence the English crown could deliver. But they would not let him die quickly. His death was to be a performance, a warning carved in flesh. As soldiers dragged him back to his cell, the crowd outside chanted for blood. Some were there for vengeance, others secretly to witness history. For they all knew that what was coming was no mere execution. It was the destruction of a man who had once made kings tremble. That night, London did not sleep. The air carried the faint tolling of bells, the whispers of guards, the slow pacing of horses being readied for the morning's procession. Inside his cell, Wallace sat alone. The torchlight flickered across his face, revealing not fear, but peace. Perhaps he thought of Scotland, of the green hills of Elderslie, the laughter of comrades long dead, the sound of the wind over Stirling Bridge. He had seen too much to expect mercy, but perhaps he found solace in knowing that his death would not silence the cause he had fought for. The English could kill the man, but not the idea. As dawn approached, a cart waited in the courtyard, the same that would carry his body to Smithfield, the same that would bear witness to one of the most gruesome spectacles of medieval history. The city would awake to the sound of drums, the marching of soldiers, and the last defiant heartbeat of William Wallace, the Lion of Scotland. The morning of August 23rd, 1305, began with an unnatural silence. The streets of London, normally filled with the shouts of merchants and the rattle of carts, now carried a different rhythm, the slow, deliberate beat of soldiers' boots. Through the heart of the city rolled a wooden cart, splintered and crude, pulled by two horses that seemed uneasy beneath the weight they carried. Bound hand and foot, his body bruised from chains, lay William Wallace. His face, though scarred by days of confinement, still held that unmistakable spark, the calm of a man who had already made peace with his fate. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and the faint bitterness of fear. Crowds lined the streets, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their voices a mix of hatred and awe. Mothers lifted their children to see the man who had defied the King of England. Old soldiers spat on the ground as the cart passed, while young men whispered stories they had heard, how this Scotsman had humiliated English armies, how he had turned bridges into battlefields, and how his name had once made even Edward Longshanks curse in rage. The king himself was not present that day, but his will was everywhere, in the soldiers' cold eyes, in the judge's sealed orders, and in the rope, coiled like a serpent beside the scaffold. As the cart creaked through Cheapside, Wallace's head turned slightly toward the sky. For a brief moment, he saw sunlight break through the gray clouds, a reminder of the open air of Scotland, of the freedom that had once been his. Some said he smiled. Others swore he whispered something under his breath, a prayer in Gaelic no Englishman could understand. Whatever it was, it silenced those nearest him. It was as if the condemned had blessed himself, not with the mercy of the church, but with the defiance of the free. The cart finally reached Smithfield, a broad, open space already filled with thousands. The platform was high, draped in black, and surrounded by soldiers in polished armor. At its center stood the gallows, a simple beam of wood, thick rope hanging from its arm. Beside it, tables had been laid out, crude instruments of punishment glinting in the sun, iron hooks, knives, axes, and fire. Wallace's eyes met them only once. He did not flinch. The crowd roared as he was dragged from the cart. The soldiers tore the rags from his back, revealing the marks left by chains. Blood had dried into his skin, but his stance was still upright, almost regal. When the presiding officer read the sentence aloud, "William Wallace, for treason, murder, and rebellion against the crown, shall be hanged, drawn, and quartered," the noise of the crowd swelled. To the English, it was justice. To the Scots in hiding, it was martyrdom. The executioner, masked and silent, placed the rope around his neck. The noose tightened as Wallace was lifted from the ground. The weight of his body pulled the rope taut, his chest heaving, his face turning pale. But the order was not to kill him yet. Hanging was only the beginning. They wanted him to suffer, to make his death an example carved in memory and flesh. When his body went limp, but his heart still beat, they cut him down. He fell to the ground, gasping, still alive. The crowd's cheers turned to an eerie hush. What came next was worse than death itself. Tendons trembled under the strain. The executioner approached with a knife, small, sharp, designed for precision. What followed was the act that would echo through centuries. He was castrated. Wallace was stripped naked and tied to a wooden frame. His limbs were stretched until the alive, his screams tearing through the air like the cry of an animal in pain. Yet even in that agony, witnesses swore he did not beg for mercy. He looked toward the crowd, eyes burning with something greater than rage, something closer to defiance. It was as if he wanted them to see that though they could destroy his body, they would never own his spirit. The brutality continued. His abdomen was opened, and his entrails slowly pulled out before his eyes, a horror meant to unmake the man who had defied a king. The smell of blood filled the square. Even hardened soldiers turned away. The executioner held Wallace's heart aloft before the crowd, declaring it the heart of a traitor. But in that moment, silence fell. For many in that square, even among his enemies, something shifted. They had expected to see a monster broken. Instead, they saw a man endure the unendurable, a man who refused to surrender even as his life was torn from him. When his suffering had gone on long enough, they finally ended it. His head was severed with a single strike, and his body divided into 4 parts. Each piece was sent to a different corner of Britain. His limbs displayed in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, while his head was tarred and placed on London Bridge to rot above the Thames as a warning to all who passed. But if Edward I believed this act would erase Wallace's name, he misunderstood the very nature of rebellion. The sight of that severed head did not inspire fear. It inspired fury. Back in Scotland, word of Wallace's death spread like wildfire. In taverns and churches, whispers began again of his bravery, his last words, his refusal to kneel. Stories grew in the telling. Some said angels wept above Smithfield. Others claimed the executioner's hands shook so violently that he had to be replaced midway. None of it mattered. The truth was already legend. Among the Scottish people, Wallace became something greater than a man. He became an idea. The English could control the castles and the land, but they could not kill the memory of a man who had dared to say no to tyranny. Children were told his name like a prayer. Songs were written in secret, passed through generations. Wallace's soul, they said, walks the highlands still. In the months following his death, Edward Longshanks tightened his grip on Scotland, sending fresh armies north. But something had changed. The Scots were no longer afraid. Even the nobles who had once betrayed Wallace began to see that submission had bought them nothing but shame. One of them, Robert the Bruce, would soon rise, carrying the torch Wallace had lit. When Bruce led his forces to victory at Bannockburn in 1314, the cry that echoed across the battlefield was not for wealth or crown. It was for freedom. It was for Wallace. The irony was cruel. Edward I, the king who had spent his life trying to subdue Scotland, died only 2 years after Wallace. He never saw the rebellion end, nor did he live to see his own son humiliated by those same Scots. The man who had broken Wallace's body could not break his legacy, and though London Bridge held his head for months, it became a symbol of England's shame, proof that even a king's wrath could not extinguish the flame of one man's courage. Over time, centuries softened the memory, but not the message. In Scottish villages, the story of William Wallace became part of the nation's heartbeat. His image appeared in manuscripts and songs, his name whispered in rebellion after rebellion. The poets called him the Guardian. The common folk called him the Brave. Even as empires rose and fell, his story endured because it spoke to something eternal, that the power of one unbroken will could outlive the might of armies. In London, however, the place of his death faded into obscurity. The gallows at Smithfield were taken down. The marketplace was rebuilt. But every stone there carries a shadow, the echo of a voice that refused to bow. Even now, centuries later, if one stands in Smithfield at dawn, when the city is quiet and the air is cold, it's said you can still feel the weight of that morning. You can still hear the murmur of the crowd, the creak of the rope, and the whisper of a man's final breath, a breath that carried the word freedom. History remembers William Wallace not for how he died, but for why. He was no saint. He was fierce, flawed, and stubborn. But he believed something few dared to, that the right to live free was worth more than life itself. In his final moments, he proved that belief unshakable. His body was quartered, his name condemned, but his story became immortal, spreading from firelit gatherings in the Highlands to classrooms and films centuries later. His voice, though silenced by steel, still speaks. The brutality of his execution, the castration, the disembowelment, the quartering, was meant to erase him. Instead, it sanctified him. The English chroniclers who described the scene wrote of a man destroyed. The Scots who heard it imagined a man transcended. For them, his agony became a kind of baptism, a purification through suffering that consecrated Scotland's struggle for independence. Wallace became not merely a warrior, but a martyr. When Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots, he carried Wallace's dream like a banner unseen. When the Declaration of Arbroath was written in 1320, proclaiming that Scotland would never be enslaved, its spirit was Wallace's. And when centuries later the world spoke again of liberty, his words echoed in distant hearts. "We fight not for glory, nor riches, nor honors," one chronicler quoted him as saying, "but for freedom alone, which no good man surrenders but with his life." And that was his victory, not on the battlefield, not at Stirling Bridge, but here, in the very act of dying unbroken. Every empire that sought to rule Scotland learned the same lesson. A nation built on memory cannot be conquered. Wallace's execution was meant to be the final act of a rebellion. Instead, it became the first chapter of a legend. Today, in the heart of Sterling, his monument rises, a stone tower piercing the sky, standing over the fields where he once turned the tide of history. Inside, a single sword rests, massive, weathered, and cold. They say it belonged to him, though centuries have blurred the truth. But when the wind sweeps across the hill and strikes that tower, it hums like a whisper from another time. Tell them, it seems to say, that I was not afraid. William Wallace died in agony, but he lived forever in the story of a people who refused to kneel. And perhaps that is the truest kind of immortality. Not the body preserved, but the spirit remembered. The man who was hanged, drawn, and quartered became the heartbeat of a nation. His blood became its ink. His death became its anthem. So when history speaks of him, of his capture, his trial, his execution, it does not end there. It ends here in the living echo of his defiance. For even now, when Scotland's flag rises against the gray northern sky, it carries more than colors. It carries the memory of a man who once stood alone before an empire and whispered, through the blood in his throat, the one truth no sword could silence. Freedom is not given, it is taken.